Good evening, ACW family. My name is Palesa Madumo. I am Chief Executive Officer of Vuma Reputation Management. That is a PR, brand, and reputation management company, a consultancy based in Johannesburg in South Africa. I'm very excited to be on this platform this evening to discuss a very important topic, which is African solutions and a collaborative future. I am delighted to be joined by two important and amazing fellow Africans. One is David Toovey and the other is Victoria Uwadoka. Guys, welcome to our chat this evening.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Good to be here. Hi, David.
Hi.
So tell us a little bit about yourselves. David, tell us a little bit about your company. You run a company in Rwanda.
Sure. Maybe we can do ladies first and start with Victoria.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, David. That's very kind of you. My name is Victoria Uwadoka. I currently work for Nestlé in Nigeria as the Corporate Communications and Public Affairs Manager. I've been working in communication for quite a number of years. Before I came to the FMCG space, I was working in ICT. So it's been an interesting transition, but for over 18 years now, I've been in communications, and this is what I love to do. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria. David?
Thank you, Palesa. Thank you, Victoria. You may notice from my accent that I'm not originally from Africa, but I am based in Kigali and have been living there for 8 years. And actually the topic of today's discussion gels quite well with my experience and how I came to fall in love with Rwanda. When I first moved to the country, I was working on a project to document Rwanda's homegrown policy innovations. So these were a set of culturally and traditionally inspired policy innovations, including criminal courts for the genocide process, community works to do environmental cleanups, policy dialogues, and traveling the country and learning about these homegrown innovations really is how I fell in love with Rwanda. So over the last 8 years, I've been working on, campaigns related mostly to tourism and environment. And I also run my own small PR firm called Spruik.
Very interesting and very interesting way that you made yourself onto the continent. Nonetheless, I think diversity is very important when we're having conversations. I always say it's not about who is at the table, but who is not. And I think different voices are extremely important in collaborative conversations, and people from different backgrounds who ultimately are all doing important work for the continent are quite important. So very welcome, David, and to you as well, Victoria. So everyone, as you can hear and see today, we've got sort of the SADC region from a South African perspective represented, as well as West and East Africa. By no means is it the entire continent, but I think it's a good representation of some of the key areas on the continent. And I think today's conversation, we've been very excited about it as we were sort of working our way up to tonight. And we really wanted to tackle some key issues with regards to African solutions and how it's important for us to recognize our own solutions as Africans versus continuously seeking, solutions and answers elsewhere. So I think I'll start off in South Africa. We're actually going to use COVID-19 as a case study for how communication has been handled in our different regions. And, from my perspective, it's been, obviously no one was expecting COVID-19, just kind of like exploded in everyone's world one day, and the entire globe had to deal with this pandemic and this crisis. And what's been very interesting from a South African perspective is that we obviously have many social, economic issues in the country. Some of them being, jobs. There's a job crisis in our country. We have food security issues in our country. We've got public health issues in our country. We also have gender-based violence issues and other, sort of issues from a South African perspective. And what COVID-19 has done is it's actually cast a light on these issues and sort of highlighted them even further, which I think is a pro, and I'll hear everyone else's thoughts on it, but I think it's positive because what it's done is it's pushing various sectors within our country, and I think within our continent, to actually look at these issues square on and face them square on. So I think an interesting part of how these issues have then come about is that what I've noticed certainly is that we've become much closer to, our government during COVID-19. In fact, I can't remember a time I've been this close to my president and kind of feeling like I see him on TV every now and then on a daily basis, telling me about, what needs to happen from the pandemic perspective, what's being put in place from a government perspective, and not just him, but his entire ministry. And, not only has it been on broadcast platforms, but also on social media, which has been quite interesting because it's almost brought us together. So there's all these different media elements and different platforms that are actually playing a crucial role in educating people about COVID-19. And right at the heart of that, I think, is our practice, which is communication. So that's kind of like what's been happening on the South African side of things. I just perhaps would love to hear what's been happening in the other regions.
Okay, so thank you, Palesa. I think that, if we look at Nigeria and actually the West African sub-region, we can draw a lot of parallels with what you've talked about right now. The closeness to the government, greater visibility in terms of communication of what's going on and what needs to happen, taking communication front and central to connect with the people around the crisis, whether it is to reduce the level of panic, to provide information, to counteract the fake news that's been passing around, and then to give instructions on what steps that we need to take and how we need to take those steps to actually address the crisis in front of us. I think that that's been really great. And one key thing that has come through is that, like you said, our practice is at the center of everything that is happening. There's been need to communicate across all the stakeholders, whether it is the government or the private sector, the civil society, and then the enforcement agencies. Because there were key things that came up, when it comes to managing COVID-19. One is the health challenges. The other is, how do you keep the economy going? The other was, how do you ensure that people get access to the essential services and products and commodities that they need, including food, of course, at the center of it all. So there was need to really drive a lot of communication around this. And what came out beautifully is how both the private sector and the public sector sat down together and looked at what needed to be done, who needed to do what, and what were the guidelines put in place, and how do you communicate around these guidelines so that the professional bodies or the industry bodies, the OPS, knew exactly what needed to be done and how to ensure that they're protecting the health and safety of people while ensuring that those families and people who depend on them are actually going to have access to the products that they need. Now, one thing that happened at the beginning, and maybe it happened across the other regions as well, was that there was a very high level of panic. Nobody knew what to do. And then suddenly there was, the shutdown, and then nobody knew exactly what to do. But I think that, yes, the communication might have started a little earlier, but when the communication started going out, the daily briefings and all of that, which you've mentioned as well, it was very, very instrumental to calming the level of panic, and that people could be more objective in how they looked at the crisis and what the health challenges and risks were and why we needed to do what we needed to do. I think that, that was very important. And I think that, this level of transparency and, staying always connected with the citizens, that connection between citizen and government and civil society and everybody that came in, to play on the platform of the COVID-19. I think that was very critical to help us get to where we are right now, looking at, what the predictions were and where we really think that, communication really played a central role in bringing us this far.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think the relationship between government and people is not always the most popular relationship. So I think the fact that COVID-19 has allowed that platform to flourish a little bit more, and for actually, I think, our government and our leaders to craft key messages that actually matter. And I think we're going to go through some of those a little bit later today, is actually phenomenal. So I know that Rwanda has had Rwanda is just a fascinating country. So let's hear it from the horse's mouth. David, what happened in Rwanda when COVID-19 hit?
Sure. Thanks, Palesa. I think before talking about, Rwanda's response, both in terms of just to the crisis and also from a comms perspective, it's important to give a little bit of historical context in terms of Rwanda's experience in dealing with Ebola and also HIV, but in quite different ways. So the Ebola experience for Rwanda was quite interesting in that Rwanda, had borders a country that has dealt with Ebola, is currently still dealing with Ebola, DRC, but has had 0 cases. And so there was a lot of work that was done there in terms of understanding how to keep an infectious disease out of the country. And so there was a playbook in place for highly infectious diseases. And it's just important to know that even before Rwanda had any confirmed cases, the Ebola task force was already kind of delegated and sent out to all of the border posts to scan people. So there was that experience from the grass, from that. And then from the HIV experience, it was about working hand in hand with communities to reduce transmission and identify people who are infected and ensure they had proper treatment. And so the communications elements that came with those 2 experiences were incredibly important. So it meant that, or even before the first case was confirmed, there were these channels that had been set up and were basically reactivated and strengthened. But one of the things that I think people have noted about Rwanda is that it's a very kind of values-driven country. And so there are a few principles that have guided the communications response to COVID-19. And they are trust, consistency, innovation, and leadership. So maybe if you'll let me, I just want to talk about those 4 things and just give you just a few examples of how those elements were utilized in the communications response to COVID-19. So the first one is trust. And in terms of the trust that we have, it was around how does the government kind of utilize the existing institutions that have a lot of trust in society. And so immediately private sector, government, civil society rallied around these 3 institutions, the Ministry of Health, the Biomedical Center, and the police. And interesting, in Rwanda, the police is one of the most trusted institutions, both in times of crisis and in ordinary times. The government also worked with social media companies to get leadership and the spokespeople of those institutions verified, so that whenever they were posting things, it was seen as credible information. And I think one thing that's interesting is that there was a high level of consistency. So all the health information was traveled through these 3 institutions so that people knew exactly where to go through. And I think in any public health crisis, you need to make sure that there is both that trust and also that consistency in the communications. Thirdly, this value of innovation. And as a result of partnerships, across all sectors, the government has been, quite innovative in the way that it's communicated with people. Some of you may have seen the use of drones. Drones with loudspeakers were used by the police to inform people, particularly in rural areas where it was hard for them to reach, about what they could do to protect themselves and to stay safe. And finally, the idea of leadership, and you mentioned it before with the president in South Africa. I think sometimes leadership can be an underrated form of communication. Often we talk about the tweets, we talk about the press releases, but actually when leaders demonstrate the behavior that we want people to actually do themselves, that's an incredibly powerful form of communications. And so President Kagame in Rwanda was one of the first to take up the Safe Hands Challenge. He was one of the first to stop shaking hands and do elbow bumps, and also one of the first to wear a mask. And so demonstrating that behavior was a really powerful communications technique and tool that really helped Rwanda to basically reduce community transmission to zero today.
That's fascinating, actually, David, because when you see your leadership actually doing, the elbow bumps and the foot shakes, and I don't know if anyone saw our president's mask faux pas that happened when he was trying to demonstrate putting on a mask. But what was so interesting about it is that it created so much conversation. Again, the power of, in this case, it was primarily led by Black Twitter in South Africa, and just the power of what he did, and the fact that it was just after we had introduced that you need to wear masks on a permanent basis now until further notice. And you saw the entire timeline with people, showcasing their masks, sort of like showing off their masks and making fun of our president. He came on the next day on a news channel and made fun of himself. And wow, like what a wonderful demonstration by leadership of, simple actions that can create powerful messages. So
yeah, absolutely.
Your country came up with a couple of communications conversations, and one of them is the Tutsasinda.
Yeah,
right?
good job. That's Kinyarwanda Tutsasinda. And Tutsasinda is a word in Kinyarwanda that basically translates to "we will triumph." And basically, for those of the other audience members who are following along, we wanted to share some of these case studies. And I saw a question around what solutions are African, because some of some of these questions or some of these solutions seem to be just copy pasted. And I think some of the things that we'll talk about here, these case studies from Rwanda, Nigeria, and South Africa, are African solutions or have a flavor to them that is distinctly African. And in Rwanda, my company, Spruik, has been supporting a campaign called Tuzatsinda, which has been led by an organization called Harambi, which is also linked to the Solidarity Fund, which Palesa will talk about later on. And basically, what happened in Rwanda, even before Ebola, the first case was confirmed, is that Rwandans rallied around this phrase, Tuzatsinda, we will triumph. And I want to tell you a cool example. A week before the borders closed, before the flight stopped, I was guiding a guest, a tourism guest in Rwanda's national park to go and see the gorillas, which is an incredible experience, and I encourage everyone to do it when the borders open again. And as we were going into the national park, things were just normal. We would walk through the village and things just looked normal. When we came back an hour and a half or 2 hours later, there were hand washing stations set up every 100 meters throughout the village. And when I asked one of the young boys who was washing his hands, "What are you doing?" He explained, "We're washing our hands kubera turatsinda, because we're going to win." And for me, that was such a powerful message that even in what was quite a remote area of the country, where there was not likely, he didn't have a smartphone, he didn't have a TV, he probably was just listening to the radio. Already he knew to wash his hands, and already he knew the phrase Tuzatsinda. And so, working with Harambi and the Ministry of Youth, the Development Board, the Employment Center, and you'll see on later slides, education institutions, private companies, youth organizations, we developed this campaign called Tuzatsinda. So we formalized that catchphrase into a campaign to basically give young people a sense of purpose and something to look forward to give them information, because fake news was a big problem. I think you remember at this time, at the beginning of the COVID crisis, there was a belief across the continent, in many parts at least, that Africa was immune to COVID-19. And so, obviously that was not the case, but at that time when there were low cases numbers, that was a possibility, in people's minds. And so we really wanted to provide the right information. And we also wanted to provide inspirational advice and information, and basically provide young people with the support that they needed. So some of the visuals that we created, which are on the next slide, are related to, there are kind of 4 key categories. So the first column you'll see there is coronavirus tips. So basically, like, making sure that people are well informed, making sure that they know what is happening during the lockdown, and also appreciating those people who are working to stop the spread. Secondly is lockdown tips. So what can you do while you're at home? We didn't want young people to be bored or to feel despondent or to feel disconnected. So we encourage them to stay healthy, to stay connected, to try new things, to use the tools around them. We also shared what we would call kind of well-being tips and self-care tips. So making sure that people knew that they could stay positive, that even though it's a difficult time, it's okay to feel sad. It's okay if you're not feeling 100% today, but the next day will bring a brighter time. And then finally, thinking about young people are going to have to play such an important role in the rebuilding of the economy. Rwanda has gone from economic growth of approximately 10%, and it's now looking at 2%. And in a country like Rwanda and many African countries, that will have a very tangible impact on people's livelihoods. And so young people are really going to have to step up to the plate. And so, in this later phase of the campaign, we've been sharing tips on how to prepare for interviews, how to develop CVs, and how to talk about yourself in a way that you can get a job and contribute to a company. So in the first 5 weeks of the campaign, in terms of the reach that we've had, this was a relatively small campaign. So we only initially targeted 10,000 people to engage with, but we exceeded that target within the first week or two. And we've now engaged with more than 35,000 people, and we've reached almost 500,000. And in a country of around 12 million, we think that's not a bad effort for an almost entirely free, supported campaign. So that's been really terrific. And as this campaign has gone on, we've been working, like Harambee and the rest of the organizations working on this campaign have been learning. And I think this is something that's important for us as communications professionals, is to constantly adapt based off what new information comes about. And one example is masks. When the crisis first started, we were telling people, you don't need to wear a mask. Let's save those for the health workers. But now masks are compulsory in many countries, including Rwanda. And so that different messaging means that we need to be adaptable. We need to be ready for those changes. And we need to be listening to what the health professionals are telling us, but also to what our audience is telling us, whether that's a client, whose audience is consumers, whether it's a government whose audience is the general public, and we always need to be responsive. So we've just completed a survey of around 400 young people, and they've told us that they really want information on how they can build their skills and experience, because they want to feel like they can contribute. They want to feel like they can, be positioned well to either get a job or to continue to do a good job, and that will provide them with the kind of safety and security. So that kind of information for us has been really interesting.
It sounds fascinating. And I think, as a huge fan of your country, I think, your leadership and just generally how you approach things is quite innovative. And you've mentioned some of the examples from an AI perspective and from a drone perspective. But I think when we come back to communications, Tutsa Senda is almost like, reminds me when we were first dealing with the HIV pandemic in South Africa, and the fact that we almost needed like a rally call. We needed one message in terms of what it is that HIV was about, and it was about prevention, and it was about finding ways in which you could actually prevent the spread of HIV. I can't remember, what that messaging was right now, but I do know that it was quite consistent across the board. And this campaign kind of really reminds me of that. The fact that a person who's a young boy, washing their hands because they've just seen an advert, to the oldest member of society coming together with this unity call that we will triumph is just fascinating, and I think quite powerful in the way that communications can be approached so that it's relevant to everyone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, as you were talking, just thinking about, building a whole campaign around that rallying call. So it's not haphazard, it's not everybody using it in every different way, but you've actually brought it together and aligned it to every level of communication, from the lockdown, what to do during the lockdown, how to wear your mask and all of that. So it's, it's sort of like you've synchronized the whole communication around that. I think it's powerful, talking about, using the same thing across drones, with the drones and all that, loudspeakers and all that. I think that's powerful. I think that's something that, we can learn in our own regions to do a little more of that. And, talking about Nigeria, yes, there are several rallying calls, including Staying Alive Together, basically drawing people around, the fact that we will win this thing, that we will win it together, but we haven't kind of like built a campaign around it. And that's something interesting that I'm taking away from here. And with that, if I may, I'll just like to segue into something that happened, in Nigeria. I know I started talking about, the challenges with the communication and all that. And it's interesting that you mentioned the miscommunication that, Africans will never get the coronavirus because, it's very hot here. The coronavirus will die in the heat. And then the stories around, young people will never get it. Another thing that we heard here as well is that, only rich people, get the coronavirus. So there was a lot, that needed to be done in terms of communication, to really, counteract the miscommunication that was going around. Now, one thing happened during this time. The private sector, came together under an umbrella that was called the Private Sector Coalition Against COVID-19. At first it was intended for corporate organizations, to put their resources together into a fund, to really address, this challenge that is facing us. But one fascinating thing for us, for many of us, looking at this, is that for a long time, we haven't seen this happen. The businesses, individuals, high net worth, politicians, families, whether they could afford only 1,000 naira or several millions of dollars, they put their resources into this fund to ensure that we do the right thing, for Nigeria. I could talk about the fact that, this fund was put together, the COVID was put together to really help with addressing the gap in healthcare, supporting the government in the response efforts, especially ensuring that we have enough testing centers, we have enough testing kits, we have enough PPEs and all of that. But one thing I would like to focus on is the area of communication, which, I think is at the center of what we're doing, and to look at how this coalition, of different stakeholders came together to really provide the support that was needed in terms of communication. Now, we know that communication can be very expensive, right? I think in our different regions is the same. It can be very expensive to put out adverts, to be on radio and all of that. But there's one beautiful thing that came forward as well, that, the media houses, the television houses, the radio houses actually supported this program with airtime, free airtime. Some organizations stopped all their advertising, marketing advertisement and all that, to use that airtime for COVID-19 communication. And that went a long way to help. Now, this coalition had a target of how much we're going to raise, but right now we raise about 27 million or so. But that's not really a problem, because we know that we have a target and we're going somewhere. And what we've seen happen is that these communication materials have been done in different languages. In Nigeria, we have like 3 major languages. So we have communication in Igbo, which is one of them, Hausa, Yoruba, and then in Pidgin English. You know, I think I have an example on one of the slides. So it's talking about, you know, the stopping the spread, okay? And then it's talking about it in the local language. We call that the Pidgin English, you know, speaking in that language that reaches the masses. I think everybody in Nigeria understands this, you know, and can read it, you know, and then creating some in cartoon form. There are TV adverts, there are videos and all that on YouTube, on television and all that. But the striking thing about this is that because everybody came together, we could reach more people. We could have more airtime. More people can get this information via radio. And, you know, we have a team of volunteers also working on the fields to take this information to the communities. You know, we have teams that go in to distribute palliatives, but as they're distributing the palliatives, they're actually passing out information in local languages so that the people within the communities would understand this. Now, at the beginning of the lockdown, we had some challenges, you know, with security and all that. But with this level of communication, reaching even the communities and the grassroots, that helped to sort out that situation within a week. You know, we had quite a tricky time there for 1 week, but this has helped. And I think that, you know, one thing that came through for me and for a lot of us is that for a television house, you know, you can look at the media now. Many media houses, you think about them, you know, like they're out there to just keep their businesses going, even through the COVID-19 crisis. They're also facing challenges, but they didn't sit back and watch other corporate organizations do something about the COVID-19 crisis. They actually step forward and they offer the airtime to ensure that we get this communication to every nook and cranny. Now talk about the lockdown, the interstate lockdowns and all of that. You needed a very high level of communication to ensure that there was a synchronization between what needed to move and what needed not to move and how to move. So all these levels of communication were really, really critical in managing the crisis. Yes, we might not be where we want to be right now, but we're not where where it was predicted that we'll be now. And I think that communication played a key role in that. And this private sector coalition against the COVID-19 has really, really been amazing. And I think that, you know, it's something that we need to take forward from here and even going beyond COVID-19 to look at how to maintain this level of collaboration to ensure that the things that need to be done, whether it's in healthcare, in education, and in communication, and, you know, in managing crisis, is done more efficiently.
I think what you've said is fascinating, particularly when it comes to media, because we know how media survives and the fact that it survives on advertising. And the fact that, you know, people came to the party, people who need those funds to survive came to the party to provide that free airtime, I think really speaks to the power of collaboration. And can you imagine if there was sort of like a continental type of call to do that type of thing, to dedicate some time to important messages for the African continent, messages that united us on platforms that are quite, you know, far-reaching in their effect. I think that would be fascinating, and it's something that I think we need to think about and think about how we can take further moving forward. I know in South Africa, we've had huge media houses actually close down as a result of COVID-19, which has been extremely sad. Some of, you know, media houses that you never expected actually, because they didn't pivot on time, they didn't get online on time. And as a result, they were hard hit, you know, by the crisis. I know in Rwanda, on the campaign that you worked on, David, you took a different view. You sort of thought, let's support media so that, you know, they can stay alive as well. So it's a very interesting mix of approaches. Tell us how you guys handled it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it comes from what we saw. Maybe, Palesa, would you mind putting the presentation on full screen? We just had a request. Maybe it'll help the audience to see. There was some interesting kind of analysis that came out, not necessarily from Africa, but basically saying that you know, a lot of these large, you know, newspapers, whether online or otherwise, were making their COVID-19 coverage free, but the advertisers didn't want to be associated with that coverage. So they were specifically saying, we don't want our ads to go on any COVID-19 content. So it was kind of a double whammy. It was the media houses weren't able to, you know, they saw themselves as playing this role as a public health kind of advocate, but at the same time, the advertisers were staying away. And in Rwanda, I mean, the media has been quite good in supporting, you know, the health-based messaging. And we thought, given that we do have, you know, limited resources, let's use some of those resources to support local media because it is a very difficult time for them. So let's use this budget that we have put aside for it to support local media where we can, and then use the free platforms and social media and the kind of follower numbers that we had otherwise got. And I think the media houses that we worked with have appreciated that. It's not to say that we won't necessarily try with others to kind of use free airtime, but we think where there is funds dedicated and available for that kind of public health information, you know, it can be incredibly powerful and can sustain these media organizations that we need as much as they need us.
Exactly. I was about to say, you know, sometimes it is a love-hate relationship with PR people and media, but we are definitely in a symbiotic relationship. So it's quite, it's an important discussion, I think, for another day in terms of how do we sustain each other, because one without the other doesn't actually quite function. So we've got a question here from Gideon Obasogi, or Obasoji, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it properly. He's a Nigerian studying humanistic science. Humanistic sciences of communication in Florence, Italy. And his question is, what do you think is an African solution to COVID-19? Because what I see in most African states is a lot of copying and pasting, as it is in Europe and America. Anyone want to answer that one?
Yeah, I think that David mentioned something about that, you know, when he was talking, that it's not just about copying and pasting. Sometimes information is already available and you don't need to go and recreate the wheel. What is important is to take that information that comes from there and adapt it to your own environment. So I think that in the way that we've communicated in Africa has not really been a case of copy and paste. I mean, I listened to David talk about it, and Palesa has spoken a little about what happened in South Africa. If I look at what happened in Nigeria, yes, there was information that came from the World Health Organization and others, you know, and I want to really stay away from the scientific, you know, because that's not the focus of this. But I've seen, you know, the way communication was done, what platforms were used, what vehicles were used, what types of messaging was put out. I think that we did a good job, really, you know, in adapting it to our own environment. You know, I talked about earlier using the local languages, for instance, leveraging radio, leveraging TV, and leveraging the social media, you know, and then also putting it in local languages, speaking in the pidgin English. Sometimes you're not really recreating the wheel. And with COVID-19, nobody has ever seen COVID-19. It's a new animal, really, not just for us in Africa, but in the West, everywhere. And everybody's learning as we go along. So I think we've had to depend a lot on the World Health Organization, which actually is a coalition of all the different stakeholders when it comes to health, and then also the NCDC. I think that, you know, those learnings are not bad in themselves, but what we have done to a certain extent, and what we need to continue to do as Africa is, you can take information from wherever it is, but you need to look at your own context as well and adapt that content or that information or that data to your own content. Sometimes you might say that, yeah, we have a challenge of data. Yes, we understand that. And that's something that we're working on. But with what we have available, I think that we have made some progress when it comes to that. And we know exactly how to leverage information that we get and how to reach people where they are in the community it is in the rural areas, in the urban areas. So I think it's a case of adapting, not totally recreating the wheel. I don't think that there's any solution that you can say right now is only for Africa, or is only for Europe, or is only for Asia. I think that we all need to learn from each other and adapt. As we're talking about collaboration across Africa, I think it's global as well. So Africa needs to take what we can from the other civilizations that have some more information, and then actually adapt it to our own context. That's what I think we need to do.
Absolutely. And I do sort of slightly, well, strongly disagree with Gideon. I think it's unfortunate we couldn't see the original slides, but every case study that we've actually discussed today is quite tailored to, you know, the region and the country in the language that you know is spoken in those regions. So I think that we have done maybe not the most perfect job, but certainly a phenomenal one. And, you know, as communicators, we're educated in English and a specific type of English that needs to be spoken, and that is the way that you communicate. But actually, with TIA, right, this is Africa, and, you know, you've seen like in the campaign that you just shared, Victoria, with Pidgin English, and the fact that if that's how people understand something better, then why not use that versus, you know, something else. And also, David, you also spoke about, you know, reaching people in the grassroots. And I think that speaks a lot to, you know, the power of tailoring and the power of communications on the continent, which I think we've done quite well. Please do share your questions as we go. We will answer them. I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a campaign that South Africa launched in terms of dealing with COVID-19. And as you can see on the top right-hand side, it's the Solidarity Fund, which was actually launched by the President Cyril Ramaphosa. And it was essentially the entire mandate of the Solidarity Fund is to support national health by mobilizing South Africans to, and in fact, people across the globe to contribute to this fund. So quite similar to the campaign that Victoria just discussed. But all of us, as the name suggests, is in solidarity in fighting COVID-19. And why it's an interesting case study, as you can see, other than prevention, detection, care, support, you know, the idea was for people, whether it's companies, individuals, and in some cases there were payroll, you know, opportunities called payroll giving, where you would give a portion of your salary towards the fund. And currently it's raised about 2.5 billion rand. Which is absolutely amazing because it's gone to deal with some of the challenges that I spoke about earlier on with regards to food security, gender-based violence, and issues of transport and health in the country as well. How the Solidarity Fund actually worked was essentially a call to the entire nation and to the entire globe to say, guys, please donate to this fund because it's actually unity in action, and it's a way in which every single person, regardless of who you are or where you come from, can make a difference to you know, how COVID-19 is dealt with and how COVID-19 lands in different places. Again, a very strong communications call based on a saying called Tumamina, which means send me, which is the president's rally call for all South Africans in terms of, you know, what's the role that you play as a person in changing your own country. And so that's what everyone rallied towards. As you can see, Black Coffee, who's a DJ, entertainer, also raised funds for the Solidarity Fund. And again, using entertainment to gather people together and to showcase how if you communicate where the message lands, you can actually raise a lot of money, because that also raised quite a significant amount. Again, uniting politicians, the controversial Julius Malema as well was part of the fundraising. And I think just the way in which the Solidarity Fund was communicated, the way in which you know, it was pitched to people, had a sense of community and a sense of coming together, so much more than just a simple campaign for a brand. And so I think the messaging of the Solidarity campaign was extremely powerful, and it's actually the reason why it's been successful, not necessarily because it's a crowdfunding platform. One of our clients, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, actually took 2 days of trading, which is something that's, you know, really not heard of on a day-to-day, and donated fees derived from 2 days of trading under a campaign called Trade for Solidarity, where they raised, as you can see, 34 million Rand towards the Solidarity Fund. And what is fascinating about this, not just because it's the JSE that's actually known as a company that is big and bold and I suppose inaccessible, is that actually everybody from the worker at Checkers who swipes you know, your groceries as you go through, all the way to a huge organization like the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, called and came together to the president's call for Tumamina. And again, so similar to what happened in Rwanda, in South Africa, people were able to put aside their backgrounds, where they come from, what they think about politics and all of that. And for me, that's the power of communication. It's that communication that says to people that it doesn't matter where you come from, it doesn't matter how much you give to the Solidarity Fund, even 1 Rand, you know, can lead to powerful things, such as somebody actually receiving food at a time that they were unable to do so. So again, the power of communication. And I think for me, it reminds me of a book that I read by Dambisa Moyo called Dead Aid a few years ago. And she spoke about the 4 horsemen of Africa's apocalypse. And she speaks about that the things that we talk about when we're talking about the continent have to do with war, disease, corruption, and poverty. Those are the 4 things that that position Africa when people talk about it from an international perspective. But even ourselves as Africans, we do the same. So we almost, I guess to Gideon's earlier point, we almost replicate what people say about us. And I think it just, this entire conversation, this entire campaign, such as Solidarity Fund for me, just said, imagine if we as communications people started taking more control of the type of things that we speak about and the type of ways in which we promote ourselves and the type of ways in which we look at collaboration across the continent, and started being you know, united in how we position this continent. And I think that is something that is fascinating for me, and I don't know what your thoughts are. We've been talking about collaboration for many years, but I think sometimes it's a bit slow in actualizing.
Yeah, sometimes it's really slow in actualizing collaboration and all the other good things that we talk about. But I think that, you know, in times of crisis, I know you were talking about the challenges in South Africa, that, you know, this crisis kind of magnified those crises and then actually led to more action, more intentional action, you know, to address these challenges. I think that, you know, that's the same thing when we talk about collaboration. We've been talking about collaboration, you know, working together, every sector, you know, what you're looking out for the other, and, you know, basically sharing our best practices across the continent, even within regions of the continent, you know. So if I talked about Nigeria in the West African context, how much are we coming together and collaborating? The good thing is that I think we've started. Okay, if I look at, you know, West Africa, we have the ECOWAS, and I remember you talking about a union of the Southern African countries, Palesa. I don't recall the name.
Yeah, and I think that was the PRISA as well, Public Relations Council of Southern Africa. Yeah.
Voila. Okay, so we have these platforms, we have these opportunities to collaborate. We have the African Union. That is a platform that we could actually drive a lot more collaboration around. I think that, sometimes we look at things in silos. There is no politics without education, without health, without communication. It's all about, the well-being of the citizens. It's about the growth, the economic growth, the socio-economic growth of the whole continent. And I think that, what this has brought to light, the COVID-19 crisis has brought to light, is that we didn't replicate some of the things that we learned with maybe AIDS, the management of AIDS, management of Ebola across the continent. Yes, I know that in Rwanda, David really talked about how that was leveraged across the platform. But in Nigeria, we managed the Ebola crisis as well, and we did a great job of it. But did that turn out to be a playbook that we could share across Africa, or we could actually share with each other so that we didn't have all the false starts that we had? I think that, what we have achieved with COVID-19 in the different countries, in the different sub-regions, we can actually bring them together and leverage them all across Africa and learn from those as case studies and learn from what went well, what didn't go well, what can we do better, and actually generally share with each other and help each other to get better. Not just as communicators, but as countries. Our economies can be so much better if we learn from each other. ICT is very strong in East Africa. Can we leverage that across all of Africa? There's so many things that are going well in different regions that we can actually leverage across Africa. And I think that it's something that we can live with, all of us as a community, because we seem to be the wheel that keeps, our different clients and societies turning. As communicators, how can we enable that collaboration across Africa? How can we be the drivers of this collaboration across Africa? How can we set the pace, set the example, and actually advise and guide our clients and our principals in how to drive more collaboration across Africa?
Absolutely. And I think, David, there's a question for you. Sorry, I'm also cognizant of the time. From Larissa Hilton that says, how has each industry come together in Rwanda to address COVID-19, and how has national strategic communications supported this unified solution?
Sure. Thanks so much, Larissa. And if anyone else on the call has questions, please do type them into the Q&A, and we'll be able to get through to them as we go. It's a really good point, Larissa. Thanks to the kind of Tuzatsinda rallying cry, industries, from telcos to, textiles manufacturers really did come together to support the response. So for example, the telecommunications companies provided free airtime to health workers. They also created campaigns to support young people, to share how they've been creative and productive at home, and provided prizes for that. And in terms of the textiles industries, many of the companies that were producing, say, for example, construction clothing, or, some of these larger textiles companies, or even the handicrafts companies, started making barrier masks. So quite quickly, these industries were able to get on board with the Tuzatsinda movement. And because there was a rallying cry behind it, they felt like they could join it. They felt like there was something to join. And I think that's something that's really important when we're running communications campaigns. Often we don't see the way in which that people feel, and they can latch on, they can be part of something. Especially when we're running these campaigns online, we don't see the kind of practical result. But if companies can feel like there's a framework for them to join, like the Solidarity Fund, like the Kakovid in Nigeria, like Tuzatsinda in Rwanda, then there's an action point for them. So I think that's the main way. And I think the strategic communications is about acknowledging the work that these companies have done, and basically saying thank you. So those companies that started producing barrier masks, the Food and Drug Administration in Rwanda quickly approved, those who were producing them properly. The campaign that telcos are running was supported by the Ministry of Health and the Youth Ministry. So I think that's an important part of it as well. Have a campaign, have a structure in place, and then acknowledge when people do actually contribute.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Larissa says thank you. Sylvia has a question. Sylvia Uhira. How can we be more intentional using communication strategies to support neighboring countries still struggling with containing COVID-19 pandemic, particularly targeting the youth? There's also another question, because I'm worried that we're going to run out of time. It says, I would like to know how countries disseminated information to children, people with special needs, and any other special groups. This is from Caroline in Kenya. I think perhaps we can tackle the first one as part of our conclusion for tonight, because we don't have a lot of time left. And it's speaking specifically about targeting youth and how we can actually use the different strategies to support neighboring countries that are still struggling. And I think that, you know, in every generation, there's going to be that group of young people who are actually making a mark and who are actually leading the movement of change in our countries. I actually believe that there is a huge opportunity for a continent-wide youth movement that can actually, not just for COVID-19, produce African solutions, but I think just generally moving forward. So that's my 2 cents worth of opinion on that question as we wrap up for the evening. David and Victoria, what are your thoughts on that question? And if anybody also has comments on the dissemination to children and people with special needs.
Okay, so I think you've talked about, you know, dissemination of information to youth, or how strategic communications can help support youth. Now, dissemination of information to children, you know, and then people with special needs. I know that in Nigeria, for instance, there were targeted outreaches to people with special needs. Either, you know, they are living with challenges, either physical or, you know, otherwise. That was one way. And then to children, you know, in Nigeria, there's this young person, I just forget his name, that created a cartoon that really spoke to children, that still actually speaks to children, you know, and it's been online, and, you know, some of us pick it up and show our children, you know, because it's very understandable. They are cartoons and they're really targeted as children. But what I think is missing there is a more proactive, a more coordinated approach to addressing children in times of crisis. I know that we focus a lot on the parents and all of that, but I think that it's about time that, you know, as Africa, I think you know, that's a good question. We look at, when a crisis happens, how do we ensure that we are really targeting children and ensuring that we're adapting the communications for children? I think that's something that we need to take into account here.
Mm.
Maybe you can wrap up for us. There are a couple of comments that perhaps I should just read as you wrap up. They say, thank you for the insightful discussion thus far. I particularly like the throwing of the siloed approach, which has been the bane of development of the continent. And I won't read the whole comment. The second one says, I strongly believe that Africa will be the provider to the most vulnerable of essentials of the century ahead. Sadly, its power and potential has been largely underestimated and in many cases dismissed. The focus is becoming stronger, though, on the continent, which is a cause for hope. What are your thoughts on that, David, as we wrap up?
Sure. I mean, I've worked all around the world, whether in Australia, whether in the UK, whether in Germany, USA, but I've never been more excited to work in Africa. The continent has such incredible ideas, has such incredible people, and it's been a true joy and blessing for me to be able to work on the continent. So I think my response is, as communicators, especially those working in Africa, and especially for Africans, is to tell your story on your own terms. Yeah. Don't tell your story in opposition to something else. And this is especially true around COVID, where we potentially can fall into the trap of telling the story against fake news. But we should actually, our job as PR people is to create content. That's our responsibility. So my final message would be, create campaigns, create content, tell the story of Africa, tell the message that will help Africa to overcome COVID and, you know, to grow and develop and provide more opportunities for people on the continent or the country's own terms, in its own way, in a way that best suits those people, because those stories are there. We just need to be the ones to tell them.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I also think as an industry, you know, this platform is exciting, Africa Communications Week, but it's also time that we continue these type of conversations outside of annual platforms, and we normalize having these type of communications. So I know that I've got 2 new BFFs anyway, that I'll be talking to whenever, you know.
Yeah.
But it's key, honestly, jokes aside, it is key for us to communicate a lot more.
Absolutely.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for joining us. Have an awesome evening, everybody.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Perfect. Thanks. See you online.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you, everyone.